Diversion provides great opportunities, as we've been hearing about, to keep people out of the formal criminal justice system and provide them with support to get their lives back on track. But are the benefits of diversion experienced equally? The David Lammy Review and other reports have highlighted barriers to people from black and ethnic minority groups. Barriers accessing diversion which can exacerbate racial disparities in the criminal justice system. So let's discuss some of the unintended consequences. Format of this is we have a panel of 3 speakers. I'll ask them each briefly a question, then we'll get into a panel discussion. So I'm going to ask Bami Jolaoso from the Centre for Justice Innovation. Done a lot of research in this area, Bami. Can I ask you briefly to summarise what your research has shown?
Sure. So I'm going to mainly talk about youth diversion because that's what our research has covered. But yeah, we know that diversion is a great tool for reducing reoffending, for getting people into the support that they need. But there's a lot of disproportionality that happens, racial disproportionality, because we're not focusing on what happens further downstream in the justice system. So the justice system as a whole, we know that there's a lack of trust, especially from black communities. And that lack of trust and I guess poor decision making at some part can mean that black children, for example, are not accessing diversion in comparison to their white counterparts. And this was something that was pointed out to us by Youth Justice Services, that they felt that they were getting a lot of children coming through who were getting more serious outcomes in comparison to their white counterparts, which meant that further along down the line, children weren't being offered diversion, or diversion was being given as a tool to kind of up tariff because, for example, black children were being assessed as more at risk or high risk.
Thank you very much, Bami. James Davidson from Sussex Police. You've been piloting diverting children to youth offending team panels, even if they did not accept responsibility for the offence. Was this an attempt to try to deal with racial disparities? And if it wasn't, was it a consequence of what you did?
So the initial trial was to be child focused, actually. So that's my world as well, as Children's and Young Persons Inspector, and this was a consequence, if you like, of what we trialled. So we realised that there was a barrier, that you either resolve all those problems around trust and confidence, which is a huge job, and every agency is working hard towards it, especially in the police with the unconscious bias. All the time you've got your stop, search, arrest and use of force. That's going to impact on your eligibility criteria because it's going to impact on the trust and confidence and what people say in interview.
Okay, we'll pick up on some of those themes in a minute. Sade Abiodun. Sade is a partner at THB Solicitors. Sade, what's been your experience of the way racial disparities are sort of baked into the criminal justice system?
I practice across Essex, Suffolk and Norfolk, but trained in, well, prior to that, worked in Leicestershire and trained in London. And it is different, completely different. Each area tends to deal with youth diversion differently. And I think there needs to be a more consistent approach across all forces. And you will know, well, I experienced that diversion as far as Leicestershire and that area is concerned is perhaps dealt with better. And I'm not giving them any preferential treatment or whatever. It's just because there is a greater mix of Asians, blacks, Polish and Eastern European in terms of youths with that background in Leicestershire than anywhere else I have come across. And as such, police officers in that area are more aware of the various cultures and so are perhaps more open in their dealings with them. There is still a mistrust. I'm not going to say there isn't. There is still a mistrust, and there is still some unconscious bias. I've witnessed it and things of that sort. But there just needs to be a bit more consistency, and officers need to know the audience, read the room, and be able to better communicate with children in general, young people in general, but also be able to, I suppose, empathise and understand the background of the person you are dealing with, because until you do, you are not going to be able to offer the best of yourself to them and get the best out of that person you are dealing with.
Thank you. Well, we'll now move on to a panel discussion. And Sade, if I can start kicking off from what you've just said, with your experience, how much is the admission, having to admit an offence in order to qualify for a diversion scheme or an out-of-court disposal in the traditional sense, how much of that is a barrier for people from minority ethnic groups in your experience?
It 100% is. Last year, perhaps in the summer, dealt with a young person who had committed a criminal damage, was completely drunk, and couldn't remember it. However, there were sober witnesses who confirmed he had committed the offence. Just give him the out-of-court disposal. The only barrier was the fact that he couldn't remember. Why is that so important?
So
an officer spoke to his sergeant. The sergeant said, no, charge him, he's going to court.
So had there been a sort of outcome 22 option available, you don't have to admit it, but clearly there's a problem here, there's an underlying problem, you know, that you can go on a programme or do something for that.
He accepted what others who were sober said he had done. The barrier was the fact he couldn't remember doing it. Why couldn't he remember? Because he was intoxicated. So clearly there is an issue with alcohol. Let's address that issue. Let's teach that person that if you get too drunk, you're probably not going to remember what you've done. Therefore, you can't control yourself. You could commit more serious offences in that state. Instead, we charge him. We take him to court. Why? What lasting impression have you left with that young man? What lasting impression of the first time he's ever been involved with the police as well? What lasting impression have you left with that young person of dealings with the police, having been not promised, but it being said and discussed with the interviewing officer that if you make admissions, there's a possibility that you're eligible for an out-of-court disposal.
Was there an element of distrust in the system in this person, or was that not a factor? Because
it wasn't, but it now will be, because his biggest concern at court is, what about my future job prospects? I now have a conviction. Why didn't they consider me for this, that, and the other? But it all boiled down to he didn't remember. Spoke to the prosecutor. Is there any way we can bat this back? No, the decision's been made. Why? Because he couldn't. It was infuriating.
I can see that. That's coming across.
I'm so sorry. It really was.
Bami, have you seen that in the research that you've done? But what I'm particularly trying to get at is whether there are some people who just don't trust the system, so they won't go down the route of admitting something that's obvious.
I think before we even look at that, we have to think about why the justice system puts so much on an admission of guilt, why we care so much about someone showing remorse or having a form of admission of guilt in order to receive support. I think that's where the issue lies, especially with children, because I think a lot of us can remember being asked, did you do this thing that was obviously bad? And you don't want to admit it because you don't want to have that feeling of guilt. Guilt is a very heavy term, and research shows that. So kind of...
James comes onto your pilot, which was designed to sort of steer kids away from the justice system in this way. Do you think there's a danger, though, that if you're saying to kids, well, you don't have to admit your offence, that's sending a bad message? I mean, there might be some parents that
it is
wary of that.
Or victims as well. So obviously, we're victim-led by the victim code. But I suppose it's important to make the point now that There's a lot of research out there to suggest that the human brain doesn't develop until they're 25. You can't control impulse behaviour and risk assessments, and that's sort of the last form. So there needs to be some flexibility with children. They're going to make mistakes, and those mistakes shouldn't follow them around for the rest of their life. So if we can get that across to victims and the wider public, then there'll be more understanding.
Sade, I'm interested in that point about the denial option being ruled out of these schemes. What do you think of that?
Can I start on the no comment point? As a solicitor, advice is given, and any solicitor, bar in one instance, who tells their client what to do should not be doing the job. The training is you get your instructions, you get disclosure, you get your instructions, you give advice, but make it clear and plain to every single person, child, adult, that you deal with, that the final decision they make is up to them. You're only there to give advice. You do not work for the police. You don't know what additional evidence the police haven't disclosed to you, because disclosure is enough to be able to take instructions and give advice. So therefore, I'm not saying tell me everything, but try to be as open as you can be and recognise that we're dealing with someone who's particularly vulnerable, who's quite young, might not trust you, in fact, might not trust me. I've gone into interview, I've gone into consultation where because I'm challenging your instructions, I don't think you're here to help me. I don't trust you. I think you're working for the police. I don't want you to represent me. We get it as well as you do. So please try to be as open, because it's very rare that I will tell a child to answer no comment, but then understand that parents, the home life, also has quite a huge impact. In terms of your question in denial, I do feel, I do come across them. One person has admitted it, been dealt with by way of an out-of-court disposal. Someone denies it or answers no comment because, again, a lack of trust. They've ended up at court. There's got to be more done to bridge that there's a gap.
But denial is a difficult problem, though, isn't it?
I know, but why have we denied it? Is it because they've not had legal representation? Is it because they've not fully understood what's going on? There are various reasons why people deny offences.
You get into a tangle if you allow people with denial to get a sort of an easier option than people who admit it.
It's not necessarily an easier option, is it? It's
but
working.
They wouldn't get a criminal record. You know, if you said if you deny it, you won't get a criminal record. You'll get some diversionary activity. But if you admit it, you're going to court. You'll get a caution. No one's ever going to admit anything.
I think they need to be given more than one chance.
Okay.
Don't just interview, get that denial, and go straight into a charge. Perhaps interview, get the denial, and then suggest either intervention, not in out of court disposal. Put them on bail and get the youth offending team to intervene. Perhaps get them to seek the most that I have come across who have denied, and this has been at court, who have denied an offence in interview and ended up at court, have tended not, particularly children, have tended not to want to seek legal advice at the police station. But the minute legal advisors get involved, you assess the evidence, you speak to that person, and you get their instructions. Their instructions are amounting to an admission or a partial admission. At that stage, if they've been on bail, youth offending have been involved, or the youth justice system has been involved, you've perhaps got solicitors involved, we can then possibly, and I do it, ask for a second interview.
Okay.
Ask for a second interview, even on occasions where parents have contacted, say, my son has now told me he lied in his interview. Could you possibly contact the officer to say, can we now do another interview because we want to now tell the truth? It's not just one chance.
There needs to be more flexibility.
We have to be. These are kids we're dealing with.
We could speak probably for hours about this subject, but we don't have time. So thank you very much to Bami, Sade and James for absolutely illuminating and honest discussions.